The map is indestructible, the essay and title piece of the collection, Volume 2 of the Truism and the Rational Trilogy. This will be Part 2 of the paper, starting with Section 5. The proof of arithmetic's consistency could not be relative, but had to be an absolute proof. But after Gödel, such a proof was impossible. He succeeded at oddly proving that there are true arithmetic propositions that are not provable, meaning proof and true are not similes, meaning consistency and correspondence aren't, and that obliterates any dream for a formal system, at least as classically understood. For a system to be consistent means that it does not yield any logical contradictions, and if reality is contradictory, AB, as Hegel teaches, and Korzybski, though, no consistent system can actually be about reality, except perhaps by removing humans from it, without humans perhaps realizing it, as discussed in 2.1, belonging again 2.1, land waits. This is what Korzybski understood, and this is why we might welcome Gödel's work as helping us move toward a science of sanity, though oddly through a theorem that seems to suggest madness is our destiny. Irony can be a gift. For sanity's sake, a concern of Korzybski is for humanity to establish an accurate understanding of humanity itself, and that entails accepting the fundamentally abstract dimension of the human creature, AB, which he associates with time binding, and that the impossibility of a formal system can point us toward considering. Korzybski writes, "Now, it is perfectly clear that of all the things with which human beings have to deal, the most important by far is man himself, humankind, men, women, and children. It follows that for us human beings, nothing else can be quite so important as a clear, true, just, scientific concept of man, a right understanding of what we as human beings really are. For it requires no great wisdom. It needs only a little reflection to see that if we humans radically misconceive the nature of man, if we regard man as being something which he is not, whether it be something higher than man or lower, we thereby commit an error so fundamental and far-reaching as to produce every manner of confusion and disaster in individual life, in community life, and the life of the race." Korzybski believed that where identification was present and in this allowed to spread like a virus, a study and understanding of man would be impossible, meaning we would fail in our most important duty, and the loss of sanity would be proof that we were so failing. We could say that Korzybski emphasizes time because temporality is fundamental, almost by definition means isness, AA, cannot be fundamental, but instead something like becoming must be, AB, for time is profoundly a matter of change. Where temporality is stressed, it will be unlikely that we fully define humans according to stable isness, precisely because time entails change. And definitions, like symbolic schemas, are very important to Korzybski, noting that humans need to think a lightning strike as an act of God, and that used to think a lightning strike was an act of God, and that this definition had a large impact on how they reacted to the event. He wrote, "When lightning struck a house, the population naturally made no attempt to save the house or anything in it, because to do so would be against the definition which proclaims a phenomenon to be a punishment for evil. Any attempt to prevent or check the destruction would be an impious act. The sinner would be guilty of resisting the supreme law and would deserve to be punished by death." Definition has a large impact on how humanity acts, defines what constitutes practical and impractical, and so on. Truth organizes values as the conflict of mind discusses. To the question, what is man, Korzybski writes, "I hope to show clearly and convincingly that the answer is to be found in the patent fact that human beings possess in varying degrees a certain natural faculty or power or capacity which serves at once to give them the appropriate dignity as human beings and to discriminate them not only from the minerals and the plants but also from the world of animals. This peculiar characteristic human faculty or power or capacity I shall call the time-binding faculty or time-binding power or time-binding capacity." Korzybski calls plants chemistry binding, animals space binding, and humans time binding. This is because humans possess the capacity to summarize, digest, and appropriate the labors and experiences of the past, to use the fruits of past labors and experiences as intellectual or spiritual capital for developments in the present, to employ as instruments of increasing power the accumulated achievements of the all-precious lives of the past generation spent in trial and error, trial and success, to conduct their lives in the ever-increasing light of inherent wisdom. To Korzybski, humanity is in which the past lives in the present and the present for the future. Humans have the unique capacity to unify events, experiences, and so on through time into and within the human mind. For example, I can experience a girl yesterday named Sarah, remember her name 2 weeks later, and call Sarah to see how she is doing. Through time, I carry a memory that 2 weeks later I organize my actions around. If I see a house one day, a cottage the next, and a castle the day after that, I can unify all these experiences through space-time and to the abstract concept of building, an idea that can help me think about and live in the world. Humans can unify experiences together through time and organize their lives according to the unities they create, making them distinct from all other living organisms on Earth. As we've already touched on, while using our maps, we are prone to confuse the abstraction of X with the actuality of X, to confuse the signified with the signifier. If I directly asked, is the word cat identical to the phenomenon of cat? We know what the answer is, but in practice, when we're not thinking about it, the mistake is easy to practically make. We can act as if a person who is an athlete is nothing more than an athlete. A person who is sick is nothing more than sick. Constantly, we treat humans as if they are limited by the signifiers used to refer to them. Korzybski suggested that a reason for this problematic confusion was that humans weren't aware of how much they knew the world through abstractions as following from time binding, and so Korzybski wanted to train people to be conscious of abstracting, and he developed various methods by which humans could achieve this awareness with a focus on temporality. Korzybski hoped the more conscious humans were of their time-binding and or abstracting nature, the more mathematical and scientific humans could be about the world, and consequently achieve greater sanity and happiness. Similarly, it seems to me that the more humans accept the essential inconsistency of thought, perception, so on, AB over AA, the more accurate, skillful, and true humans can be in their approaches. Civilization is a creature. Its creator is the time-binding power of man. Animals have it not, because they belong to a lower type or dimension of light. In a world without humans, unified abstractions would likely not exist, for they are made possible by a brain, and yet at the same time these abstractions could mislead us if we organized ourselves according to the wrong definition, framework, symbolic, or the like. It is the counsel of wisdom, according to Korzybski, to discover the laws of nature, including the laws of human nature, and then to live in accordance with them. The opposite is folly. To ignore Gödel is to guarantee folly, and we will misunderstand the ways which humans are incomplete and even unnatural. Our time-binding capacity is inborn and a gift of nature. Humans can be literally positioned by false ideas and false teachings, Korzybski wrote, adding stakes to his concerns, and he considers the idea that humans are supernatural as one of those poisons. It can still be AA, as Hegel understood. Korzybski wrote, the time-binding capacity, first manifest in humanity, increased more and more with the days in each generation, until in the course of centuries man felt himself increasingly somehow different from the animal, but he could not explain why. He said to himself, if I am an animal, there is also in me something higher, a spark of something supernatural. With this conclusion, he estranged himself as something apart from nature and formulated the impasse, which put him in a cul-de-sac of a double life. He was neither true to the supernatural, which he could not know and therefore could not emulate, nor was he true to the animal, which he scorned. Having put himself outside the natural laws, he was not really true to any law and condemned himself to a life of hypocrisy and established speculative, artificial, unnatural laws. The supernatural has alienated humanity and left it with a false definition of what is man, leading to poor thinking and action, as depicted in the lightning example from above. Korzybski laments that millions still look upon man as a mixture of animal and something supernatural, and that humanity has long been wont to regard himself as being quite apart from and not as part of the cosmos around him, and consequently he has detached himself in thought, he has estranged and objectified the world, and lost the sense that he is of it, as needed for dialectical AB. But wait, doesn't Korzybski stress that the word cat isn't the thing of cat? Isn't that supernatural? Not for Korzybski, because nature and reality are dialectical and consist of different ontological levels working in relation with one another. What we think suggests the supernatural, rather, for Korzybski, suggests nature is more complex than we thought, not simply AA. And Korzybski is adamant that we make multiple ontologies part of this world in nature, not project them away, as tends to occur when people discuss the supernatural. He wants a true infinity, we might say. not something spurious. Korzybski seems willing to critique anything that keeps humans from seeing their uniqueness in this life, which is to say anything that keeps us from coming to terms and integrating with our uniqueness, which Korzybski describes as time binding. He wrote, "Among animals, as all evidence shows, the enormous majority have, without human interference, nervous systems working usually in the normal way, that is, according to the survival structure. Insanity and kindred nervous disturbance are known only among ourselves with time-binding capacities. Because we can time-bind, we can go insane, and the key to sanity is right ordering, which requires the right framework. We extend ourselves through time, which means we must consider order and how we might order ourselves. Extension and order cannot be divided," Korzybski writes. "When we speak about order, we imply extension, and when we speak about extension, order is implied, according to AA or AB. Well, Korzybski believed that the problem of order and extension are of paramount structural importance for sanity in our lives, and the only way we could address this problem was by taking time-binding seriously, which would mean we had to hunt down isness and rid it from ourselves in all areas, a move from understanding to reason." And Hegel, "Have we done this work yet? Work which Gödel justifies? Have we gone insane?" Whitehead warned that the chief danger in philosophy was narrowness in the selection of evidence. Perhaps why is found in Korzybski, connecting the question of sanity to the question of identification. Section 6. For philosophers like Schelling and Whitehead, no system of philosophy can ever claim completion, because reality itself is not a closed system. Gödel and Korzybski would agree. And furthermore, practically living this way versus just knowing abstractly it is the case is central for sanity, and even to prevent a citizen bedazzled by the mechanistic worldview from committing ecocide, as Matthew Segal writes. Furthermore, the mechanistic mode of thought, AA, leaves sensitive, value-seeking, purpose-driven human organisms feeling like aliens on our own planet, ergo insane. It's no wonder we've gone about destroying it for several centuries. And I suggest Matthew Segal's work, Footnotes to Plato. It's magnificent. In our current state, scientific materialism leaves us in the impossible position of having to deny in theory what we cannot help but affirm in practice, courting pathology. The universe endures, Bergson stresses, suggesting time is fundamental. It is against experience to say everything the universe is either deterministically already finished, Einstein's block universe, or reducible to atoms. The truth is the whole, Hegel told us, and the whole strives to keep going, versus rest in already being done. So goes our lives, so goes us. Let us align with actuality. Time is being inscribed. The essential thing is the continuous progress, indefinitely pursued, and invisible progress. The problems of order and extension are of paramount structural importance for sanity in our lives, Korzybski argues, and yet it is unlikely we will approach this problem well when infected by isness. We require a complete elimination of identity and identification, which will be incredibly difficult given our habitation, our habits and habitation. Identification is found in all known forms of mental ills, even those we don't recognize as mental ills. To resist this, Korzybski speaks of a need for us to train consciousness of abstracting, or the remembering that we abstract in different orders with omissions of characteristics, which we might describe as a movement from algebra to geometry, things to situations, and very Hegelian. This would make us AB, for a consciousness of abstracting eliminates automatically identification, AA. If we take seriously that we require words to know things and that abstractions are real, the world cannot be a place of linear and simple identification. It is always relational, progressing, structured, and ordered, which means we are always dealing with situation, a term that often comes up in O.G. Rogues to describe Leibniz, which suggests that Bergson is right when he claims that philosophy is the study of becoming in general, true evolutionism, and consequently the true continuation of science. And my understanding of Leibniz is forever indebted to Anthony Morley. What we have said on identification could be aligned with what Owen Barfield called idolatry in Saving the Appearances, another book and thinker we could associate with the modern counter-enlightenment, as I call it, which can be contrasted with the relational ontology that Barfield famously describes in the opening of the book through the metaphor of a rainbow, which Gödel's work could further help justify. And if Korzybski and Barfield can be thought together, we might say that the science of sanity depends on convincing people to see reality more like a rainbow than an idol per se. Our sanity depends on something that at first glance seems bizarre. Anyway, Barfield opens the book studying a rainbow and asking, is it really there? Rainbows aren't illusions, dreams or hallucinations, and many people could see the same rainbow, and yet the rainbow couldn't be there without eyeballs, part of the generative process with rain and sunlight. It's there like a cloud or tree, and yet observer-dependent, but not restricted to an individual like a dream or hallucination. It is a shared or collective representation. Perhaps aligning with Wolfgang Smith, Barfield then invites us to consider something, and I quote, "Now look at a tree. It is very different from a rainbow, but if the particles, as I will here call them for convenience, are there, and are all that is there, then since the particles are no more like the thing I call a tree than the raindrops are like the thing I call a rainbow, it follows, I think, that just as a rainbow is the outcome of the raindrops and my vision, so a tree is the outcome of the particles and my vision and my other sense perceptions. Whatever the particles themselves may be thought to be, the tree as such is a representation. And the difference for me between a tree and a complete hallucination of a tree is the same as the difference between a rainbow and a hallucination of a rainbow. In other words, a tree which is really there is a collective representation. Are trees and rainbows so different? Barfield, by this, does not mean the solid globe is as insubstantial as a rainbow. The solid globe is solid, the rainbow is not. Only it is important to know what we mean by solid. Barfield suggests everything could be conditioned, relational, and processed like a rainbow, which doesn't mean insubstantial, but instead would suggest that what we mean by solid might not be what we think, based on independent objects that function as their own ground, all of which might align with the anti-identification of Korzybski, favoring AB over AA. Indeed, Korzybski would prefer us to focus on visualization over identification, and thinking of the world as collective representations would better align with taking visualization seriously, which requires process and relation, AB. That said, how things are visualized also matters, for do we see ourselves in nature or as nature? A critical distinction for Barfield. Indeed, that distinction matters, and Korzybski seems to think that visualization is more likely to lead us toward a vision of reality as versus in, which Barfield might appreciate and agree is needed for sanity. In contrast to collective representations, which gain their being from participation and multiplicity, there is idolatry, which Barfield aligns with belief in objects, unparticipated in to a degree which has never been surpassed before or since. Barfield noted that when the nature and limitations of artificial images are forgotten, they become idols, which, if it is true that we've lost sight of how reality consists of participatory collective representations and not standalone objects, this would suggest reality is now idolatrous. Another way to think about this is that in religions, idols can be things which humans treat as existing as their own ground of being, without God. And if we believe in things today, which is to say objects that are the grounds of their own being, then we believe in idols, and so value images and representations in the wrong way and for the wrong reasons. In religious traditions, to believe in idols brought punishment, and if today Korzybski is right that we have lost sanity due to an identification we can associate with Barfield's idolatry, a risk we were not ready for that came with the priceless gifts of accuracy and precision, then perhaps the religions had a point. To quote Barfield at length, the earlier awareness involved experiencing the phenomenon as representations. The latter preoccupation involves experiencing them not representationally as objects in their own right, existing independent of human consciousness. This latter experience, in its extreme form, I have called idolatry. Today, we are unlike the man of the Middle Ages who was rather less like an island, rather more like an embryo, which is to say the world and environment were possibly once like a womb birthing us through our lives. Rather, today we are in a world to which we do not relate, suggesting why we might be alienated and insane. The answer for Barfield, though, isn't that we stop using thought to draw distinctions, no more than Korzybski believes identification should never be used in any form, as I don't feel that way about rationality. Both thinkers admonish that what we might call autonomous entities or autonomous identification. They are both calling for a sublation, a movement for Barfield from original participation to final participation. Owen Barfield's metaphysics might contribute to a science of sanity and awareness that participation was dead in modernity, suggesting why the mistake of identification arose. Furthermore, we have touched on Bergson, Whitehead, Hegel, and others to suggest what kind of metaphysics would align with Korzybski to help us gain a science of sanity. And here, informed by Barfield, I can't help but momentarily discuss Leibniz, as Kurt Gödel praised, as the great Austin Farrer commented on in writing an editor's introduction to Theocracy, which is a book by Leibniz, as the great William Wilson of UVA brought to my attention. Leibniz's system is not an unmitigated spiritual atomism, Austin Farrer insists, but instead tries to take seriously that we cannot discuss building blocks of the cosmos without imagination and representation, which we might associate with Wolfgang Smith again. How then can we assume that the act of representation isn't part of the building blocks? Personally, inspired by Anthony Morley, what atoms are to things, I consider monads as to situations, which is to say a monad is the smallest of all possible situations, a position I think Farrer helps support when he writes, monads, as the ultimate constitutes out of which nature is composed, stand composed together from the beginning in a minimal order which cannot be broken up. Each monad, if it is to be anything at all, must be a continuing finite representation of the universe, and to be that it must have a body, that is to say it must have other monads and a permanent relation of mutual correspondence with it. The wonders revealed by the new miracle, the microscope, suggested what the intrinsic divisibility of space itself suggests. Whatever organization is broken up, there will still be a minute organization within each of the fragments which remain unbroken, and so ad infinitum. You will never come down to loose monads out of all organization. Korzybski also stressed structure and relation all the way down, and we might see in Leibniz's possible replacement of the atom with the monad a move that aids Korzybski's effort. To use Barfield to explain the monad, we could say there is a range in which a rainbow as a collective representation can be experienced. We can't just be anywhere with just any sensory apparatus doing anything we like. There are certain conditions that we must meet, or otherwise we will not experience the rainbow. A monad is a range for collective representation, which an RCR for short, and where one RCR ends and another begins is where a new monad emerges. To put this another way, Korzybski speaks of chemistry binding, space binding, and time binding entities, and we could say that each category of binding designates a unique kind of conditionality and monad. It might sound odd to suggest that rocks have a unique RCR, but though blind, rocks are able to physically touch other physical things, as plants have a sentience and capacity to feel and grow towards sunlight. Both rocks and plants have a way by which reality is representable, say according to proximity or sentience, and even if these modes of representation cannot be made intelligible or remembered, if rocks can touch other rocks, and if plants are sentient, reality must be such where things can so represent themselves and so represent the world to themselves, even if unconscious. Sight is not the only means of representation, even if for time-binding humans it is arguably primary, and even if it requires ideas to acknowledge space-binding representation and chemistry-binding representation, it does not follow that representation requires mind, even if representation is in a way meaningless without it. In this way, we might say Leibniz is more pan-representative versus a follower of some panpsychism, which is to say everything in the universe entails representation, hence relation, situation, and so emergent potential, which also means that Leibniz might address the ancestral fossils of Quentin Malesou. What, though, is representation without mind? Well, What is mind without representation? For Leibniz, it makes more sense to make representation primary, and please note that when we try to think mind without representation, we are trying to represent something to ourselves, as we also try to represent the idea with ourselves and our minds. There are no monads where there is no representation at all, but that doesn't mean everything must be equally conscious or have identical experiences. For experience can vary with conditioning, and yet the universe still be there with its diversity of possible conditions. Each RCR of each thing is unique, even if other RCRs share its kind as space binding, chemistry binding, and yet RCRs are capable of interacting in their uniqueness because there is a shared world and or shared condition. Every RCR is uniquely conditioned as itself, yet shares conditioning with other RCRs so that they might interact and quote-unquote touch. Now, the nervous system or sense organs of, say, a human cannot be divided from its RCR, but that does not mean every RCR requires a human nervous system, nor does it mean that there cannot be diversities of conditions which generate different RCRs. When we speak of the conditions that make possible a rainbow RCR, for example, these conditions entail eyes, brains, bodies, and the like. So we should not think of conditions as object-based and or non-subjective. The sensory apparatus which makes a representation possible is indivisible from the RCR situation, and in this way a monad deconstructs a subject-object divide. Furthermore, what we can represent and what representation we can experience is tied to our body, as it chemically binding, space binding, as is chemical binding, space binding, so on and so on. Pharaoh wrote, a fuller power to represent the universe is necessarily combined with dominance over an organized troop of members, for the mind knows the universe only insofar as the universe is expressed in its body. That is what the finitude of the mind means. Only an infinite mind appreciates the whole plurality of things in themselves. A finite mind perceives them insofar as mirrored in the physical being of an organized body of members. The more adequate the mirror, the more adequate the representation, the more highly organized the body, the more develops the mind. This is a point that I think aligns with Rudolf Steiner, who Owen Barfield praised, for Steiner saw humans in need of practices for us to gain new modes of consciousness, and that freedom was found in this effort, which might also align with the hyperhumanism of Carl Hayden Smith and Gurdjieffian of Layman Pascal. The conditions of our body condition nature, for we are nature. And freedom in the realm of imagination could be found in this terrifying / beautiful space. This point brings to mind Thomas Jockin's work on beauty and virtue and suggests why we need to cultivate virtue to experience beauty. Virtue is essential in making possible the RCR in which beauty can be experienced. Monads could also be the smallest possible units in a world where systems and subjects by Gödel last proves right. And the monad also suggests there is nowhere in the universe where it is possible to not have a mode of some kind. Furthermore, if everywhere there is representation, why not make representation as emergent of real relations and what exists versus object without subjects? The monad makes observation, relation, situation, experience, modes of consciousness, and the like fundamental to reality, which means it is situation all the way down. If there are always situations, there is further always representation, for the situation must be represented to the entities involved according to their conditionality or binding. And if there is representation and situation all the way down, that means things are in a way embodied all the way down, for we will never disembody the monads and so remove their representative power. We will only reduce their bodies and so impoverish their representative power, a point with which Rudolf Steiner might agree. To review, what an atom is to a thing, a monad is to a situation, and where one situation begins and another ends is relative to the range of a given mode of representation. Mode and monad are similar as terms. A monad is where a situation can be broken down no further without losing the mode of representation. The plant monad, for example, arises where there is chemistry binding, begins and ends precisely where begins representation of the world as the plant so represents it. What is that like, and where does that begin? We can't know as humans, but Leibniz would argue that we have reason to think there are points where plant monads exist relative to a situation of plant binding. There is no identification, only representation, and each monad marks an area of representation. As there are different bindings for Korzybski, there are different monads for Leibniz, and we could say there is a plant monad wherever there is chemistry binding of plants, an animal monad wherever there is space binding, a human monad wherever there is time binding. This is not language Leibniz uses, and I might be writing a little too freely, but I find it helpful to understand monads when I think of them as areas of kinds of representations generating phenomenon unique to those conditions like Barfield's rainbow. Relative to certain kinds of bindings, where there is an entity engaged in time binding, the way reality is represented to that entity will be different, and hence there is a unique monad distinct from the monad which arises where there is chemistry binding and a different kind of representation. All right, great. But what was the point of all this metaphysical speculation? Well, that if reality is situation and geometric, that means reality can never be broken down less than a monad without ending up in fantasy. And so that means at no level of reality can we avoid consistency and or relationship, which means we must always deal with maps. And so the problem of internally consistent systems, hence the map is indestructible because situation is reality. We must live amidst conditions which can cause madness. We cannot avoid the need for a science of sanity, Korzybski, or science of the subject, Gödel, last Hegel, and this might or might not be scalable, belonging again part 2. If reality is relational, maps are unavoidable. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. You can find our books on Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated, and thank you so much for your time.